The sound that broke me wasn't my daughter's voice. It was the rip of packing tape, sharp and final, like a door being sealed shut behind me. I was standing in my own living room when Dawn placed the brochure into my hands. Glossy paper, soft colors, smiling gray-haired couples walking hand in hand beneath words like care, safety, community. The kind of brochure you give someone when you've already decided their life is over. "Mom," she said gently, the way you talk to a skittish animal, "this house is too big for you now." I remember looking down at my hands that had scrubbed floors raw, stitched hems until my eyes burned, held her feverish head through endless childhood nights. Those same hands were shaking, just a little. Dave stood behind her, arms crossed, already measuring the wall with his eyes, calculating. He had that look he got when he thought he was being practical, when he thought feelings were an inconvenience. "You left the stove on last week," he said. "That's dangerous. You're acting irrationally." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I heard my own voice say, very softly, "I was boiling potatoes." Dawn sighed, like I was exhausting her, like I was a child refusing bedtime. "It's for your own good, Mom. You're losing your memory." That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet crack deep inside my chest, like a fault line finally giving way. I was 69 years old, a widow, and apparently a problem to be solved. Before the boxes appeared, before the tape and the brochures and the careful, patronizing voices, my life had been small, but it had been mine. I woke each morning at 5:30, the same way I had for decades. Old habits don't die when your husband does. I made tea in Robert's chipped blue mug, the one with the hairline crack near the handle, and sat by the kitchen window while the neighborhood stretched awake. The radiator ticked, the clock above the sink kept imperfect time, always a minute slow. I never fixed it. Some things earn the right to be imperfect. I still cooked as if someone was coming home. Stews that simmered too long, bread baked even when it was only me. The house smelled of bay leaves and old wood, and memories that refused to fade. Dawn used to love this house. She took her first steps in the hallway. She learned to read on the couch by the front window. When Robert died, sudden, quiet, unfair, she cried into my shoulder and promised me I'd never be alone. And for a while, she kept that promise. She called every day, brought groceries, fixed the loose stair rail. Dave came later, polite at first, then distant, then distracted. He never liked how Robert had done things. Too careful, he'd say, too modest, always talking about just in case. By the time Dawn and Dave moved into their flat across town, the visits slowed. The calls became shorter. I learned not to mention my aches or the way the nights felt longer without Robert's breathing beside me. I told myself this was normal. Children grow, lives expand, parents become background furniture. But furniture doesn't hear everything. The first clue came quietly, the way betrayals often do. Dawn stopped asking before she came over. She'd let herself in, keys jangling, already mid-conversation on her phone. She'd walk through rooms with a distracted look, opening cupboards, glancing into corners. Once, I caught her standing in my bedroom doorway, staring at the wardrobe. "How big is this closet?" she asked. I joked, "Big enough for secrets." She didn't smile. Another time, Dave brought a friend, some man in a blazer who smelled of cologne and impatience. They talked in low voices, pausing when I entered the room. I heard words drift through the hallway like dust. Property value, renovations, long-term. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief makes you suspicious, that age makes you sensitive. Still, I began to notice how they spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening. "She shouldn't be alone so much," Dawn said, her voice muffled behind the kitchen door. What if she falls? She's stubborn, Dave replied. Won't listen to reason. Reason, apparently, was whatever made their lives easier. The boxes appeared one Saturday morning, just a few at first, stacked neatly by the door. Don said they were organizing. Dave said it was preparation. For what? I asked. For the future, he said, already taping another box shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt different, smaller somehow, like it was shrinking around me. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the picture frames, the edges of furniture worn smooth with decades of use. In the study, I stopped. Robert's old bookcase stood exactly where it always had. Most of the books were familiar: history, gardening, ledgers he never threw away. But one book sat slightly forward, as if it had been nudged. I pulled it free. Something metallic slid out and hit the floor with a soft, accusing clink. A key. Small, old, the kind you don't make anymore. I stared at it for a long time, my heart thudding in my ears. Robert wasn't careless. He hid things on purpose. The next morning, while Don and Dave argued about bubble wrap in the living room, I went back to the study and knelt by the desk. There was a drawer I'd never opened, not because I wasn't allowed, but because Robert had always kept it locked and I had always respected that boundary. I slid the key in. It turned smoothly, like it had been waiting for me. Inside was a manila envelope, thick and heavy with paper. My name was written across the front in Robert's careful handwriting. I didn't open it yet. Some truths need the right moment, and something told me, quietly, insistently, that my moment was coming. In the living room, the tape screamed again as another box was sealed. Don laughed at something Dave said. It sounded rehearsed, nervous. I folded my hands around the envelope and felt, for the first time in weeks, something steadier than fear. Clarity. I waited until night to open the envelope. The house had gone quiet in the way only old houses do, not silent, just resting. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes whispered. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then thought better of it. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Don once practiced spelling words, and Robert balanced the checkbook every Sunday afternoon. I smoothed the envelope with my palm, feeling the weight of it, the way you feel the heft of a truth before you're ready to hear it. Inside were deeds, letters, legal papers folded with care, and on top, a single handwritten note. Maeve, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and someone has made you feel small. I had to stop there. My breath caught so hard it hurt. Robert always did that. He saw things before they happened, not in a mystical way, just observant, patient, always watching how people treated one another when they thought no one important was looking. The letter was long, thoughtful, practical. He wrote about how we'd live simply on purpose, how he'd never trusted easy charm or loud confidence, how Dave, in particular, had asked too many questions about money too early with too much interest. I don't think he means you harm, Robert wrote, but I do think he means himself good fortune, and sometimes those two things collide. He explained the properties, plural, the small apartment building across town, the commercial unit near the old post office, the way he'd structured everything so it passed cleanly, quietly to me. You are not a guest in anyone's life, he wrote. You are the foundation, remember that. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. My hands were steady now, my mind clear. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual: toast, eggs, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Don and Dave ate quickly, distracted, already halfway out the door. We found a place, Don said between sips. A really nice community. You'd love it. I smiled. I'm sure. Dave glanced at me, eyes narrowing slightly. The movers will come Monday. Monday, 3 days away. I nodded the way agreeable women do when they've already made up their minds. Those 3 days passed in a strange calm. I watched them pack my life into boxes, labeling things donate or trash without asking. I listened as they talked about repainting, about opening up the space, about how the kids will love the backyard someday. Once I heard Dawn on the phone say, "She doesn't need to know the details, it'll just upset her." She meant me. At night, I reread Robert's letter. I memorized the feel of his words. I let the grief come, but it was different now. Less sharp, more resolute. Grief with a spine. On Sunday evening, I made a pot of stew. Dawn said she wasn't hungry. Dave said he had work emails to answer. I ate alone, savoring each bite, grounding myself in the ordinary. After dinner, I walked through the house one last time, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement. I thanked the walls, the floors, the door frames that had held pencil marks of Dawn's height year after year. Then I slept, deeply, peacefully. Monday morning arrived bright and unapologetic. The movers rang the bell at 8 sharp, 2 men in uniforms, polite, efficient. Dawn hovered, clipboard in hand. Dave checked his watch. I sat at the table with my tea. "Aren't you going to get ready?" Dawn asked, her voice tight. "I am ready," I said. Dave frowned. "Mom, this isn't the time to be difficult." I looked up at him then, really looked, at the impatience, the entitlement, the way he'd already written the ending of this story without consulting its main character. "I just need a moment," I said calmly. "Could you both sit down?" They exchanged a look. Dawn sighed and pulled out a chair. Dave remained standing. I slid the manila envelope across the table. "What's this?" Dawn asked. "Something your father left me," I said. Dave reached for it. I placed my hand over his. "No," I said, not loudly, just firmly. I opened the envelope myself and laid out the papers, one by one. Deeds, titles, letters. Dawn's confusion turned to concern. Dave's confidence wavered. "This house," I said, tapping the table lightly, "is the least valuable thing I own." Silence thickened the room. "I own the flat you've been living in for 3 years. I own the building Dave's office rents space in, and as of this morning, I've decided to make some changes." Dave's face drained of color. There must be a mistake." I met his eyes. "There isn't." The movers shifted awkwardly by the door. "I've arranged for new management. They'll be contacting tenants today. You have 1 hour to remove your belongings." Dawn stood so fast her chair tipped over. "Mom, this is insane." I shook my head gently. "No, sweetheart, this is clarity." Her voice broke. "You'd really do this to us?" I felt the ache then, but I didn't let it rule me. "You mistook my kindness for weakness, and you forgot something important." "What?" Dave demanded. "This is my life," I replied, "and I'm done being moved out of it." The hour passed quickly. There were tears, accusations, silence, doors slamming. The movers left empty-handed. When the house was finally quiet again, I poured myself another cup of tea and sat by the window. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't triumphant. I was free. After they left, the house didn't echo the way I expected it to. I thought the silence would feel hollow, accusatory, like it was asking me what I'd done. Instead, it felt earned, settled, like a deep breath after holding it far too long. I stayed at the table for a while, my tea cooling untouched. My hands were still steady, but my chest felt tender, The way it does after you've said something honest that can't be taken back. I didn't regret it, not exactly, but love doesn't vanish just because respect finally shows up. I carried the envelope back to the study and placed it in the drawer again, locking it with the same soft click. Robert had trusted me with this moment. I felt that now more than ever. The phone rang just before noon. It was Dawn. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," she said, her voice already frayed. "Dave is losing his mind. He says his boss called about the lease." "I know," I said gently. "You didn't have to do it like this," she whispered, "in front of everyone." I closed my eyes. The smell of old paper and lemon polish filled the room. "I handed you a brochure for a place to put me away," I said, "in front of strangers, in my own home." There was a pause. Then, quieter, "We were just trying to help." I chose my words carefully. Help doesn't come with deadlines and boxes. She didn't argue. That hurt more than if she had. "I need time," she said finally. "So do I replied. We hung up without saying goodbye. The days that followed were strange, but not lonely. I walked more, sat on park benches, watched people rush past with the urgency of those who think time is endless. I met with a lawyer, one Robert had already chosen, of course. He smiled kindly and said, "Your husband was very thorough." I began to understand the full scope of what Robert had done, not just the money, but the intention, the foresight. He hadn't been hiding wealth out of fear. He'd been protecting peace. Word traveled faster than I expected. Neighbors stopped me on the street, awkward but curious. A woman from church hugged me a little too tightly and whispered, "Good for you." Someone else said, "I always wondered how Dave afforded that place." I didn't correct them. I didn't explain. I learned that silence, when chosen, can be a kind of dignity. Dave tried once more, this time through an email, formal and clipped, full of legal language he didn't quite understand. My lawyer handled it, efficiently, kindly, final. Dawn didn't reach out again, not right away. At night, I still missed Robert. I still set 2 cups on the counter sometimes before remembering, but the grief had changed shape. It no longer felt like loss alone. It felt like inheritance. 2 weeks later, Dawn came by unannounced. I heard her car before I saw her, idling too long like she was rehearsing courage. When I opened the door, she looked smaller somehow, tired, older than I remembered. "I don't have long," she said. "Dave's waiting." I stepped aside. "Come in." She didn't look around this time, didn't measure or calculate. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped tightly around each other. "I didn't know," she said, "about the properties, about Dad." "I know," I replied. "He says you humiliated him." I tilted my head. "And what do you think?" She swallowed. I think I let him talk me into things because it was easier than arguing." That sounded familiar. "I was scared," she continued, "of you getting older, of being responsible. And Dave kept saying it was practical." "Practical for whom?" I asked. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "I don't know anymore." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm protecting myself." She nodded slowly. When she left, she hugged me, not the careful, polite kind, the kind that trembles. It didn't fix everything, but it was something. The flat they'd lived in stayed empty for a while. I had it cleaned, repaired, fresh paint, new locks. I rented it to a retired teacher who brought me muffins every Sunday and never once asked me for anything else. I started attending a local seniors group. Just coffee at first, then conversations, stories. I realized how many of us had been quietly pushed, managed, minimized. One woman cried as she told me about her son controlling her pension. Another laughed bitterly about being called confused whenever she disagreed. I listened. Then I spoke. I shared my story, not the details, not the money, just the feeling, the moment when kindness had been mistaken for permission. Something shifted in that room. We began meeting regularly, sharing resources, names of lawyers, advice, strength. I didn't set out to lead anything. I just stopped being quiet. One evening, months later, Dawn called again. She sounded different, steadier. "Dave and I are separating," she said. I closed my eyes, absorbing the weight of it. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "He's angry," she continued, "at you, at me, at everyone." I exhaled slowly. Anger is easier than accountability. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can we have dinner sometime?" I smiled into the phone. "Yes, we can." That night, I sat by the window with Robert's letter in my lap. "You were right," I whispered into the quiet, "about all of it." The clock ticked, the radiator hummed. The house held me the way it always had. I was still here. There's a particular kind of attention that comes when people realize you are no longer who they thought you were. Not louder, just sharper. It began with small things, a pause when I entered a room, a different tone in conversations. People who had once spoken over me now asked questions and waited for the answer. I hadn't changed my voice, I hadn't changed my clothes, but something had shifted in how I stood inside myself, and the world responded. Dave, on the other hand, unraveled loudly. His name came up more than once at church functions, whispered behind paper cups of coffee. A lease dispute here, a professional restructuring there. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just the slow erosion of reputation that comes when charm is no longer enough to cover character. I didn't celebrate it. Consequences are not revenge. They are simply gravity doing its work. One afternoon, I ran into Dave's sister at the grocery store. She hesitated when she saw me, then nodded politely. "He talks about you a lot," she said, awkward but honest. "I imagine he does," I replied. She studied me for a moment, then said quietly, "For what it's worth, I think you were brave." That surprised me more than anything else. The community found out in pieces. Someone mentioned I'd taken over management of the flats. Someone else noticed the improvements. New lighting, fair rent increases clearly explained. Tenants who'd lived in fear of sudden eviction slept easier. One man shook my hand and said, "No one's ever treated us like adults before." I understood what he meant. Power, when wielded quietly, looks a lot like respect. I began attending city council meetings, not to speak at first, but to listen, to understand the systems that made it so easy for older people to be dismissed, moved aside, spoken for. Eventually, I did speak, not emotionally, not angrily, just clearly. "I am not confused," I said into the microphone one evening. "I am experienced. There is a difference." The room went still. Afterward, people approached me. Women mostly, some men. They shared stories, asked questions, thanked me for saying what they hadn't been able to. I went home that night and slept better than I had in years. Dawn and I rebuilt slowly. We met for dinner once a week, neutral places at first, a small Italian restaurant, soup and salad, safe topics. Gradually, we spoke about harder things. "I didn't mean to erase you," she said once, staring into her wine glass. "I just didn't know how to be the parent and the child at the same time." I nodded. It's a difficult balance. She told me about the arguments, the control disguised as concern, the way Dave spoke about me as if I were a problem to be managed. "I should have stopped it," she said, voice breaking. "Yes," I agreed gently, "you should have." She flinched, but she didn't argue. That's how I knew she was growing. One evening, as we were clearing dishes, she asked, "Do you hate him?" I thought about it, about the humiliation, the boxes, the brochure. No, I said honestly. I pity him. She looked surprised. Anyone who needs to diminish others to feel secure is already very small, I explained. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. The final public moment came unexpectedly. I was invited to speak at a local seniors advocacy event, just a small gathering, folding chairs, bad coffee, good intentions. I stood at the front of the room and told my story. Not names, not details, just the arc, the warning signs, the moment of clarity. I was called irrational, dangerous to myself, but the truth was simpler. I was inconvenient. A murmur moved through the room. I am not angry anymore, I continued, but I am alert, and I want you to be too. When I finished, the applause wasn't loud. It was steady, sustained. Afterward, a woman took my hand and said, "I thought it was just me." I squeezed her fingers. It never is. That night, I returned home and sat in my living room, the same room where the tape had screamed, where the brochure had been placed in my hands like a verdict. The room looked the same, but I didn't. I thought about how easily life can be taken over if you allow others to narrate it for you, how often kindness is interpreted as surrender. I poured myself a cup of tea and raised it, not in bitterness, but in acknowledgement. To Robert, to myself, to the quiet power of knowing who you are. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small permissions you give yourself. Permission to rest, to choose, to say no without explaining. I learned that slowly, the way you learn a new language later in life. Carefully, with mistakes, with grace. I stopped waking up at 5:30. Not every day, just some mornings. I let the sun find me instead of the other way around. I lingered over breakfast. I read the paper all the way through instead of folding it neatly and saving it for later, as if time were still rationed. I redecorated the spare room, not for guests, for myself. I painted the walls a soft, warm green. Robert would have teased me for it, said it looked like spring trying too hard. I turned it into a small sitting room with a reading chair and a lamp that cast forgiving light. A place to think, to be. I didn't feel guilty about it. That was new. The seniors group grew. What started as coffee and conversation became something steadier, purposeful. We invited speakers, lawyers, social workers, financial advisors, who spoke plainly and listened patiently. We shared meals. We laughed more than I expected. One afternoon, a woman named Elsie stayed behind after everyone else left. "My son says I shouldn't drive anymore," she said, staring at the floor. "But I've never had an accident." "What does your body tell you?" I asked. She smiled faintly, "That I'm still capable." "Then start there," I said. She hugged me before she left. I went home that night and cried, not from sadness, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being useful in a way that didn't cost me my dignity. Dawn and I found a new rhythm. She came over for dinner sometimes now, asked first. She noticed things, complimented the flowers, helped with dishes without being asked. One evening, as we sat on the couch, she said, "I didn't know you were lonely." I considered that. "I wasn't lonely," I said slowly. "I was unheard. There's a difference." She leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small. "I hear you now," she said. I believed her. The house felt alive again. Not busy, not crowded, just present. I hosted book club meetings, birthday lunches, quiet afternoons with music playing low in the background. I let myself take up space without apology. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the version of myself who had stood in this same living room, brochure in hand, wondering how her life had become negotiable. I wanted to reach back through time and take her hands. "Hold on," I'd tell her. "You are about to remember who you are." One crisp autumn morning, I visited Robert's grave. I brought fresh flowers and the letter. I read it aloud, my voice steady, the words familiar now. They tried to move me, I said softly, but I stayed. The wind stirred the leaves. I imagined him smiling, that small, knowing smile he used when a plan had worked exactly as intended. I'm doing good things, quiet things, the kind you liked. I stood there for a long time, not asking for anything, just sharing the moment. The truth, I learned, does win. Not loudly, not immediately, but steadily, the way roots crack concrete. Not by force, but by persistence. Dave faded from my life entirely, not as a victory, just as a natural ending. Dawn remained, changed, still learning, still my daughter. And I became something I hadn't expected. Not powerful, but whole. I sit here now, by the same window, tea warming my hands. The clock is still a minute slow. The house still creaks in the evenings, but it feels lighter, like it's breathing with me instead of around me. If there is one thing I know for certain, it's this. You are never too old to reclaim your story, and kindness, when chosen freely, is strength, not surrender. If you had met me a year ago, you might have mistaken my quiet for frailty. I spoke softly. I avoided conflict. I let others decide what was best for me because I believed love meant compromise, even when it cost me my own voice. I know now how wrong that was. Age does not erase wisdom. Silence does not mean consent, and kindness should never be used as a leash. What happened to me wasn't rare. That's the part that still lingers in my chest at night. It happens in living rooms and kitchens, behind polite smiles and careful words. It happens when people decide you are easier to move than to listen to. If my story stirred something in you, anger, recognition, sadness, I want you to know this. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. There is a moment, sometimes late in life, when you realize that peace is not something others grant you. It is something you choose. And when you choose it, truly choose it, the world has no choice but to adjust. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't heal by becoming cruel. I simply stopped shrinking, and that changed everything. So I'll leave you with this question, one I wish someone had asked me sooner. If someone tried to decide your life for you, would you stay silent or would you stand your ground? Tell me your thoughts. Share your story if you're ready. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing or supporting this channel, because voices like ours deserve to be heard, calmly, clearly, and without apology. Thank you for listening.